We have gathered here from CRG and friends of CRG and many other new people also, many students who have come from abroad and many more new faces and people in the room. So this is the inaugural lecture of City Lights. City Lights is a series of public lectures which has been conceptualized as part of the larger program project with Canadian Institute of Advanced Research, with whom CRG is collaborating. So this series has been conceptualized over a period of 10 months with different cultural and educational institutions in the city. This first lecture is titled Urban Turn, Biopolitics and the City, which is going to be chaired by Professor Ranabir Samaddar. Which is going to be chaired by Professor Shobhushati Basure Choudhury, and the speaker of the session is Professor Ranabir Samaddar. So the lecture series as conceptualized is, I'm reading from the note, drawing its name from Charlie Chaplin's iconic 1931 ode to the poetics of precarious lives lived in the interstices of wealth and prosperous spaces of the city. The lecture series, City Lights, will concern itself with the creation and recreation of the city in its phenomenological complexity, historical specificities of labor and wealth, its materiality and mobility, and with its present life as a palimpsest of the past. At the same time, as a site of logistical reorientations and infrastructural activities as part of a frenzied and continuous envisioning of a future. The future of the urban takes place in the city through the interaction between technological innovation and imaginary planning and enacted fantasies of change and enforced closures and reclamations of planned space. The urban future, governed and upended by politics of the city and the urban political, is also caught between aggression and care, violence of plans and regulations, and the contingencies of the informal, visions of the future and imaginations of the past, between generations, between greed of property accentuated by practices of profit-making and assertions of justice, care and protection. Lectures in the series will reckon with the making and unmaking of the city in history and space. So here today we are about to start with this session. I'll hand over the mic to Professor SBRC.
Thank you very much, Poshali, and very good evening to all. And as already she has introduced this lecture series, I'm not going to repeat this, but let me introduce today's speaker, which many of you may know. So in the first of the 10 lectures, this evening Professor Ranabir Samaddar will reflect on the urban turn, biopolitics and the city. And Professor Samaddar is the distinguished chair of Migration and Forced Migration Studies in the Calcutta Research Group, and he is currently a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research. And he belongs to the critical school of thinking and is considered as one of the foremost theories in the field of migration and forced migration studies. His writings on migration, forms of labor, urbanization and political struggles have signaled a new turn in the post-colonial thinking. Among his influential works are The Marginal Nation, Transborder Migration from Bangladesh to West Bengal, Karl Marx and the Post-Colonial Age, and one of his most recent publications is written in the background of the COVID-19 pandemic, entitled A Pandemic and the Politics of Life. So we have requested Professor Samaddar that after his lecture, so it will be open for discussion and questions and comments. And I would also request you that you can, raise your questions both in English or in Bengali. কাজী যদি কেউ মনে করেন বাংলাতেও প্রশ্ন করতে পারেন, কোনো অসুবিধা নেই। আমরা এখন অধ্যাপক সমাদ্দারের বক্তৃতার জন্য অপেক্ষা করছি। আমি তাকে অনুরোধ করব। সো প্রফেসর সমাদ্দার।
it's a pleasure to get back to academics. For I remember that in 2015, when this chair was conferred on me, Oniban was present there in 2015, and many old faces of CRG were there, and this will possibly be my last lecture as the chair before I debut office. So it's a pleasant occasion as well as something that I was remembering of the activities under the chair for the last 10 years. As Paushali has mentioned, we have a small grant from the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and it's not a research grant, so we can't do proper research on that, but we can do some, let's say, deliberative activity, hold meetings, and think together on what we title as humanity's urban future. So as the letter came to me, I thought that, humanity's urban future is a big thing, and possibly we are too small to think of that, but why not think about the urban present? So with that idea in mind, we have thought of two programs. One is this lecture series that Paushali has mentioned, titled as City Lights. The other is a plan that we have is of holding or organizing 8 to 10 session certificate course on the making and unmaking of cities in South Asian perspective, and hopefully we'll be able to do it in February and March for a month, and it will be a distance program. Now, the title, as Paushali mentioned, is on urban turn, biopolitics and the city. First is the background of this theme. The urban turn of our time begins with agrarian crisis. In fact, the agrarian sector in today's capitalist economy the world over is facing crisis. The emphasis of the capitalist economy is now more on making cities the sites of greater investment. Cities are merging, gobbling up suburbs and countryside, becoming greater and greater in size, inserting more and more people as they become destination points of thousands and thousands of migrants. Cities become multifunctional, acting as big trading marts, points of large networks of roads or digital connectivity, sites of specialized services, haven for refugees and migrants, and centers of administrative management, besides functioning as venues of parliamentary democratic politics. Cities today conjure up the people, the mass, and what some call the multitude. It is no accident that of the 20 largest, most popular cities of the world, 17 are from the non-Western world, according to a UN estimate of 2018, according to the World Urbanization Prospects. In terms of density of population, cities like Lagos, Delhi, Mumbai, Karachi, Kolkata and Manila cross the limit of 5,000 persons per square kilometer. In terms of area also, these are huge cities. Istanbul, Jakarta, Bangkok, these cities appear endless when we think of the city as an urban area. It is said that these huge urban holdings are evidence that cities are pushing growth today economically and demographically, worldwide and nationally. Urban extraction practices are pushing this growth further. Cities are today living monsters. They suck anything and everything, including human life, as if they do not need the countryside, as if they have no prehistory or history. It will not be unnatural to ask, with all the Weberian attitudes of a modern bureaucracy, can professional government agencies control such massive urban formations, regulate movements of migrants and settle the population of a city? To answer such questions, one must begin with an understanding, namely, that the current story of the city is not one of seamless hyper-urbanization, although the impact of urbanization in terms of resource transfer and perceivable increase in employment opportunities, particularly in the unorganized sectors, is far greater than what the official figures suggest, at least in case of India and in other cities of the developing world. There is also a deep-seated contradiction between the two images of the city, namely as an engine of economic growth and as an inadequate and extremely contested and conflictive civic space for interaction among its inhabitants. The paradox is starker today as Indian cities begin to appear as sites of continuous fragmentation and gentrification after the advent of neoliberal reforms in the 1990s. The city is reorganized in terms of infrastructure in a way that fragments work and for much of the time reproduce the old social conditions. The infrastructural reorganization calls for a permanent presence of the migrant as an intolerable but necessary factor in this process. The second aspect of this reorganization is that it is also a reorganization of space that depends increasingly on a rent economy. Consequent to all these, the city produces almost incessant violence, struggles, agitations and movements. Yet discussions on urban future particularly discussions on scale of urban growth, often fail to face frontally this unprecedented phenomenon in human history. The question is, what drives the hyper-growth of some cities of the global south today? What is its broader significance in terms of shaping our urban future? The point to note is that these are, to borrow a term from Saskia Sassen, global cities. They set the urban paradigm. The urban growth today is a paradoxical combination of centralized corporate functions and dispersed economic activities. These central functions are becoming more and more complex. Hence, large global firms outsource many of these functions to specialized service firms which are located in these cities. The global services are materialized through global networks of affiliates and strengthening of cross-border city-to-city transactions and networks. All these result on one hand in an increasing disconnect between these cities and their broader hinterlands, at times even their national economies, and on the other hand in the growing informal nature of a range of economic activities. These cities are marked by, to use Sassen's words again, expulsions of large populations from urban wealth and protection measures and increasing brutalization of urban life as a whole. Cities become carceral sites. by everyday conflicts and contradictions. They oscillate between visibility and invisibility, ultimately gazing at the city without being seen. They express the tensions between gentrification and habitation practices that accompany the violent remaking of cities, a sort of ulcer with which the city as an organism has to live, as it cannot be removed without the city itself dying. This is a spatial spectre which haunts the orderly and the smart fantasies of neoliberal urban space. In these otherworldly places, which I have termed as non-places or non-spaces, migrants and the lower classes enact relational practices of amelioration and rupture against the status quo, practices that are neither simply a form of resistance nor simply an escape. Their dwelling and habitation practices burst into processes of production of urban space, unsettle the very meaning of urban life, remake cities in the face of neoliberal urban reconstruction policies. This is in fact the cover page of a study that CRG has just published. I think it will be soon on our website, so and maybe there are sample copies here, I don't know. But this would be one of the instances of what I have been saying. It is not that in the pre-liberalization era there was no urban transformation. But to make sense of what is being transformed, we have to perhaps recall the rise of the industrial city in the past and the urban transformation taking place in its wake. Finance-driven accumulation reflected in private-public partnership policies and rent-centric urban growth is most evident in the big cities and is now spreading across wide regions as infrastructural activities including building airport cities, speedways, export processing zones, express tracks, new port cities and dedicated corridors with hubs mark the logistical rush. All these bring in new migrant labor in a variety of forms, in banking and the spread of ATMs or the growth of digital infrastructure. The migrant remains an outsider to the process. The migrant tells us of a labor force that must be available whenever and wherever needed, but will not be deployed all the time. It has to remain invisible. The migrant mostly engaged in logistical services, ranging from waste reprocessing, digital infrastructure, care and entertainment industry, to various construction activities and infrastructure maintenance, not only bring out various aspects of the transformation we are here discussing, they collectively reflect on the central contradiction in this process of urban transformation, namely the necessity of a ready mobilization of labor, displaced, dispossessed, dispersed, and the often mobile and yet unable to lay claim to a space called the city. But the city must have such a labor force with the new forms of servicing it requires, as just mentioned. The neoliberal city cannot do without migrant labor. This is a scenario different from the one we were used to, the city with a city center, citizens, politics of equality, factory labor, a large and stable middle class, and a reciprocal relationship with the village, even though not always satisfactory. The transformation is also connected with a discernible shift in governmental focus, which is responsible for the enormous role of a policy regime in the making of the urban turn. For instance, governmental policies are creating and redefining what we call the social. As economic and social historians know, unemployment became a particular problem for the government at a specific time in the history of bourgeois democracy. Employment was linked for the first time in the 19th century with urban peace. Factory legislations and trade unions became crucial parts of creating the social. The city began to signify the role of urban management in a proper management of society and democracy. That the agrarian scenario was for long marked by idle labor was not a social concern, but urban unemployment became a social concern. Thus, Employment Exchange Bureau opened. Also, collective identities linked to unemployment and socialist appeals had to be broken up if cities as centers of rule had to survive. The city in this way emerged as a fully theorized object within social science discourses. In this way, the city became the defining feature of welfare state and Keynesianism a feature of government. Yet, this would not be enough for the urban term, for unemployment cannot be managed without periodic new deals, which can come only rarely. Thus, the city has to be a place for self-employment, small employments, start-up ventures, and a vast multifarious site of circulation of all kinds of commodities, from plastic toys to information, and money to sex workers and pimps. The old welfare state offered only passive support to subjects. Neoliberal governance has to integrate the restless, workless urban population into what it thinks to be the active economy, give them requisite skills, enable them to be competitive, and thus turn them into active urban subjects. Today, urban governmentality is at the core of huge governmental exercises of managing economy, politics, populations, and institutions. In India, there is an urban policy. Likewise, policy for different types of cities. Policies for different occupational settled groups like hawkers, slum dwellers, city migrants, etc. Again, there are scores of acts for administering cities and urban regions, such as the National Urban Region, various metropolitan regions. Managing population groups, running integrated transport systems, restraining people from conducting in unruly ways, detailed codes of freedom and control, renewal systems for every possible urban attribute, defining boundaries of a city, zoning a city from within, etc. Since there is an increasing shift in size of favor of urban population, governmental policy exercises aim towards conceiving the city, conceiving the nation like a city. In this way, measures for creating schools, hospitals, bazaars, bus stations, colleges, all end up as urban sites of social investment. Restructuring economy, politics and the state, what we call as the agent of passive revolution, begins with transforming the city. This way of managing population is, however, increasingly dependent on a form of dispersed policing that is exercised over urban population, ordering, dividing, distributing, and linking urban population groups and segments of urban territory. Expectedly, managing urban migration as a part of broad urban governance is a matter of policing as well as step towards ordering of populations, territories, labor markets, and administration of all these. The process happens on multiple scales, ranging from the hierarchical division of urban territories, of segments of a single urban territory, and of urban institutions into ethnically and racially coded zones. I now come to the last section, which is the global nature of what I call the southern urbanism. Few fundamentals need to be kept in mind when we think of the urban term on a global scale. First, geographic dispersal of economic activities turns out to be a key factor feeding the growth and importance of central corporate functions. Second, as cities take on a more and more corporate character, highly specialized services firms engaging in activities ranging from accounting, public relations, telecommunications, digital work, care and entertainment, to waste processing and reprocessing, retail business, and other such services call for more labor from outside. Third, in place of the usually presumed cyclical nature of urban migration, the economic fortunes of the urban migrants become increasingly disconnected from the broader hinterlands from where they have arrived. They become subjects of transnational urban systems. And finally, the strategic role of the services they offer as inputs for a city is matched by the informalization of these services even when connected with manufacturing or industrial services. The growing informalization of a range of economic activities is not possible without a market for these services. And these activities act as a supplement to the high profit-making firms at the top of the urban economy. Indeed, the city becomes global only with the presence of the migrant. Antonio Gramsci's formulation of the question of the South may help us in understanding the global nature of urbanization today. The Southern question is one of relations. Relations between capital, peasantry and land ownership. Relations between corporate capital and medium and small capital. In-migration of destitute labor from even poorer regions and beyond, and out-migration of labor in search of work. Formal economy and informal labor processes. Legal regime of urban property and illegal and semi-legal economic and social existence of a large section of city population. And finally, an elect nation symbolized by the city and its disempowered and disenfranchised part, in short, relations of power. But also, lest we should forget, southern cities carry strong imprints of wars, conflicts and contentious claim makings, and in that sense, a permanently unstable relation between war and peace, stability and instability, and order and violence. At the same time, the southern question in many ways makes the city of the south a counter-figure to Delhi, counter-figure to the power of the north. Thus, Marseille to Paris, Naples to Milan, Kolkata to Delhi, Karachi to Islamabad, or Chittagong to Dhaka. Yet these cities, whether on the Mediterranean or on the Arab Sea or Bay of Bengal, or on the Aegean Sea, inherit the same north-south relationship, in short, what Gramsci called the southern question. To remove any possibility of misunderstanding, southern perspective and labor perspective are interrelated. These global cities are integral parts of world capitalism, yet they bear marks of southern globalization. Southern globalization carries the lineage of the colonial time. Large southern urban concentrations are islands of industry, services and development, working at the same time as giant branches of northern corporate capital and determining the grotesque unbalanced structure of southern economies. Amidst the dynamics of city making, in the southern mode, politics too changes. Politics in informal settlements and workplaces, through forms and institutions of mobilization, and importantly around issues of life, and thus issues of care and protection from periodic public crises, including major health crises such as the recent COVID crisis. While the city remodels its governing structure in the wake of the public health crisis such as the SARS, Ebola, COVID, some researchers have termed this as pandemic urbanism. It also witnesses new forms of solidarity, caregiving practices, indeed new life forms. Care, protection and solidarity as urban categories operate through both formal and informal structures. We have to place the homeless migrants' everyday encounters with structural violence through their experiences of indignity, humiliation and insecurity, the illegality of their housing claims, and the informality and precarity of work in the broader map of what is called dangerous labor on which city depends. These experiences tell us of what Michel Foucault had described as, within quote, living dangerously. I shall just skip a few things and make few remarks about the grey world of urban biopolitics and finish. We must note the open-ended nature of the biopolitical responses of lower classes to situations of urban crisis. Such responses may be seen in clandestine urban wars, street violence, mass suicides as form of protest or communal riots. The response can take the form of demanding improvement of public health infrastructure, sick pay leave or pension. I think we have a picture of the pension strike in France. Or the form of a movement for solidarity, all of which are in contrast to individualized survival practices. Indeed, as destitution aggravates with diseases and environmental disasters, the question of care acquires greater significance. In short, the notion of biopolitics from below is not an ultimate explanatory principle telling us of all that is happening around us and a solution to all our problems. Biopolitics of the lower classes exhibits historically specific character in specifically different situations, specific responses of the lower classes to what they think to be the crisis of life, which has much to do with the nature of a particular crisis, economic, social or humanitarian crisis, marking that situation. Studying biopolitics from below is thus more a task of developing a perspective on the activism of the lower classes. It is a perspective that enables us to think in new ways about the role of working people in the making of the modern world. What would have happened if, say, the ranters, diggers, levelers, mariners, runaway slaves, market women, rebellious soldiers and other destitute groups who joined the repeated rebellions in the 17th century England and elsewhere in Europe had become victorious? Christopher Hill, John Gurney, Peter Limbaugh, Marcus Rediker, Lauren Kureli, Nigel Smith and other historians give us tantalizing glimpses of the desires and dreams of the working people of that era when primitive accumulation had begun in right earnest, forcing out many people from land. Their visions were not singular or standardized. They expressed various ideas of a desirable life, rooted at times in their specific religious beliefs, at times in their condition as mobile subjects in that age of forced displacement, enslavement and shipment across seas. They were also victims of high taxes and summary corporal punishment. Their histories are often recorded as those of sex, thus largely obliterating their biopolitical response to the crisis in their lives brought by the remorseless logic of primitive accumulation. This form of politics would not have re-emerged without the growth of cities, which meant new conglomeration of settlements, new localities and peri-urban regions, with these settlements coming into being as the network of urban settlements grew in the early modern age. With growing peasant dispossession and pauperization, predominantly informal new labor forms, changes in property relations and separation of households, urban experienced huge population surge. Urban resource management today, primarily of common goods like electricity, water, transport, open space, roads, became in time issues of urban governance, hence of budget, planning, fiscal management, taxation, public-private partnership and eventual privatization. Yet, no amount of policy innovation can make it satisfactorily manageable, as these expanding urban forms of labor and peasant destitution at home accelerate migration to cities on the strength of networks. Networks multiply as labor forms multiply. They help villages to survive. For these villages, cities are the commons. Peasants, artisans, craftsmen and women consider they have the right to the city. In these mixed scenario, many old protocols of life are displaced. New solidarities come into being. Members of these solidarities become dangerous classes and urban time becomes unsettling time. As history of biopolitics from below shows, it is marked with illegalisms produced within urban formations. The development of a punitive society to regulate and differentially control the illegalisms of a society has been integral to a biopolitical history of modern time. Tyrannical orders are to be balanced by clemency and sympathy, taxation balanced by welfare, strictness by protection, and market laws by judicial softness. To be truthful, urban reconstruction has a contentious relation with biopolitics from below. The institutional nature of the endless program of urban reconstruction indicates ruler strategies to cope with semi-legal and illegal nature of many urban settlements and clear the areas of any complication or obstacle in the smooth passage of goods, services and capital. On the other hand, these areas carry the stories of alliances and networks of subaltern groups, legitimacy acquiring techniques of these groups and classes, and new repertoires of collective action produced by new collective identities. Hitherto unconnected actors in slums and shanty towns acquire political identity through linking up with parties. They become the political entrepreneurs. They involve themselves in elections. They organize local meetings and become agents of government welfare program in these areas. They become legitimate actors in mass politics. They use resources of governmental institutions to serve the purposes of affiliated groups in slums and earn consequent goodwill. The slums and shanty towns are governed by these leaders who take lead in responding to crisis. Women in particular increasingly come forward to initiate collective action. The city becomes a site of endless tussle between institutional planning by the government for a safe and secure life and biopolitical ruptures from below. The life of the lower classes is the issue of contention. Who will control the subaltern life? The city thus represents what we may call precarious geography. Precarious geography is fractured geography. It symbolizes what has been termed as contested urbanism, at the core of which is a clash of claims and violence continuously perpetrated on the urban poor. In such scenario, class politics operates through space-producing exercises. If Marx showed how the space of factory, subsequently with its assembly line and shop floor managed arrangement, was the mobilizing ground of the working class, today, poorer neighborhoods of the city, featured by shanty town, slums, informal settlements, neighborhood markets, vacant places and occupied plazas, precisely the terrain of what can be called as bad circulation, are the sites of subaltern mobilization. There you find prophetic discourses, new festivities, constantly crafted ideas of crisis and emergency that are alternatives to the main discourses of war and conflict and biopolitical strategies from above. These mobilizations transcend the clear-cut distinctions between communities of evil and good, piety and racist or xenophobic vocabularies, autonomy and dependence, and city building and staying put in the ghettos. It is a space that opens to new relations and ties beyond simplifications of the nation and state, sovereignty as control and mobilization as simply command, and asks us to strive for more dynamic understanding on the question of autonomy. The unsettling nature of the plebeian quarters of a city haunts urban ontology. In cities across the world, Immigrants and or suspected immigrants have been declared as illegal aliens, thrown out of the respective countries or pushed into detention centers. Court-inspired or administration-ordered citizenship drives, verification campaigns transform the city into a camp. It is a form of existence always on the verge of illegality and detention. The camp form, some have argued, dates back to the colonial age, when the colonial subject was always the detainable figure. Counter to it today is the relentless production of informal, occupied and illegal or semi-legal camp, slum, shantytown existences whose inhabitants are people who have arrived and settled illegally or are on the move. The camp form symbolizes the always temporary, precarious and informal zones of a city. These zones create fractures on the political, spatial and temporal relation between citizens as legal subjects and their proper representative rulers. It represents the life condition of the confined, deportable, displaceable and differentially included in the urban world. They are, as I said, present like an ulcer with which the organism will have to live. Hence is the question for the city rulers, namely, how can these settlements govern? Biopolitics from below erupts in the background of resultant policies, in and out condition of life, the enmeshing of detention and circulation, the informality and the dwelling realities. So in speaking of counter-conduct, we need to be first aware of the spaces of such counter-conduct. These cannot be easily termed as spaces of resistance, for they transcend the accepted binaries of resistance or obedience and direct practice of politics and policies through representation. They present a model of politics which can be best termed as biopolitics as practiced from below. In the process, they show an alternative idea of life, of how life can be differently governed. In this way, they put in the question the way people are governed. This is the nature of biopolitics from below, a form of counter-conduct. Biopolitics from below is like a hymn poised on the borders of ethics and politics. I cannot end this lecture without referring to the events in the city through the past 1.5 months, as they have relevance to the urban situation described by me. The upsurge of sentiment and emotion, massive popular mobilizations, occupation of streets turning the latter into spaces of solidarity and resistance, solidarity with medical workers who signify care, and the feeling among thousands of oneness with the violated and the murdered young junior lady doctor. All these constitute a great experience of what the philosopher called counter-conduct. In the post-COVID era, mobilizations of women in uncounted numbers for the two principles of care and solidarity heralds new politics. The nature of this new politics is still not clear, save that it is, if you will, biopolitical in nature. In that sense, it is still grey. However, it certainly carries the possibility of the arrival of a counter-power. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Samaddar, and I'm not going to sum up his lecture, but for the sake of many of us, I will try to sum up his lecture in Bengali. যেটা অধ্যাপক সমাদ্দার বলার চেষ্টা করেছেন, আমি জানি না সেটা কতটা আমি তুলে ধরতে পারবো, কিন্তু উনি যেটা প্রথমেই বলেছেন যে নগরের ভবিষ্যৎ, এইটা নিয়ে কাজ করতে গিয়ে ওনার প্রথমেই যেটা মনে হয়েছে সেটা হচ্ছে নগরের নাগরিক জীবনের বর্তমানকে ভালো করে আগে বোঝার দরকার, এবং সেটা আলোচনা করতে গিয়ে, সেটাকে নিয়ে গবেষণা করতে গিয়ে ওনার মনে হয়েছে যে কিভাবে কৃষি সংকটের মধ্য দিয়ে আধুনিক নগরের উৎপত্তি হয়েছে এবং আধুনিক নগরের বিকাশ হয়েছে, তার নির্মাণ ঘটেছে, এবং সেখানে এটা বুঝতে গেলে বর্তমান যে পুঁজিবাদের বাস্তবতা তার নিরিখেই একে বোঝার দরকার। এবং নগর মানে এখানে কিছু পরিকাঠামো নয়, নগর মানে কিছু রাস্তাঘাট নয়, নগর মানে এখানে জনতার ভিড়, নগর মানে এখানে মানুষের উপস্থিতি, যেটাকে আন্তোনিও নেগ্রি মাল্টিটিউড বলে। সুতরাং সেই জনতার ভিড়ের মধ্যে কিভাবে আস্তে আস্তে নগর সেটা বিভাজিত হয়, বিভাজিত করা হয়। এবং কেন বিভাজিত করা হয়? কারণ নগরের যে নিষ্কর্ষী অর্থনীতি সেটা ধীরে ধীরে শহরতলি এবং গ্রামকে গ্রাস করতে আরম্ভ করে, তাকে ঘিরে ফেলতে আরম্ভ করে। এবং সেই জায়গায় এই নব্যউদার অর্থনীতির সাপেক্ষে যেগুলোকে বিশ্বজনীন নগর বলে মনে হয়, সেটা যে বৃহত্তর পুঁজিবাদী কাঠামোর মধ্যে গড়ে ওঠে, সেটাকে উনি তুলে ধরতে চেয়েছেন। এবং এই যে একটা নগরের মধ্যে অনেকগুলো স্তরভেদ এবং তার মধ্যে যে ভৌগোলিক বিভাজন, সেটা আলোচনা করতে গিয়ে উনি অনেক দার্শনিকের প্রসঙ্গ টেনে এনেছেন, ওয়াল্টার বেঞ্জামিন থেকে আরম্ভ করে, যিনি বলেছেন যে কিভাবে ধনতান্ত্রিক উৎপাদন ব্যবস্থার মধ্য দিয়ে মানুষের বাসনা, আকাঙ্ক্ষা এগুলো আরো বেড়ে যায়, এবং সেটা মানুষ কিভাবে নগর জীবনের মধ্য দিয়ে সেগুলোকে আয়ত্ত করবার প্রচেষ্টা চালায়। এবং একই সঙ্গে লাফেব্রের যে ভাবনা, যেখানে তিনি বলছেন যে কিভাবে পরিসর নির্মিত হয় বা পুনর্নির্মিত হয় একটা নগরের মধ্যে, এবং সেটা একটা নগরের চরিত্রের ক্ষেত্রে কতটা জরুরি। একই প্রসঙ্গে এসেছে ডেভিড হার্ভের কথা বা কোলাথাসের কথা। এবং একটা নগরের সঙ্গে কিভাবে বিশেষ অর্থনৈতিক অঞ্চল এবং কিভাবে অভিবাসী শ্রমিকদের জীবন সেগুলো পরস্পর জড়িয়ে যায়, এবং কিভাবে অভিবাসী মানুষেরা তারা নগরের তার সাফাই কর্মী থেকে আরম্ভ করে স্বাস্থ্যক্ষেত্রে তাদের পরিষেবার মাধ্যমে কিভাবে তারা প্রতিনিয়ত পরিশ্রম করে যান, কিন্তু তারা বেশিরভাগ সময় অদৃশ্য থাকেন, লোকচক্ষুর অন্তরালে থাকেন, কিছু কিছু সময় তারা দৃশ্যমান হন। সেই প্রসঙ্গগুলো তার আলোচনায় এসছে। এবং এই যে উদারীকরণের মধ্য দিয়ে, অর্থনৈতিক উদারীকরণের মধ্য দিয়ে কিভাবে নগরের রূপান্তর ঘটেছে, কিভাবে এই ফিনান্সিয়াল পুঁজি বা কর্পোরেট পুঁজি তার চরিত্র পাল্টে দিয়েছে, এবং অভিবাসীরা যাদের একান্ত এই নগর জীবনের প্রয়োজন, তাদের বাদ দিয়ে নগর জীবনকে কল্পনা করা যায় না, কিন্তু তার সত্ত্বেও কিভাবে তারা বহিরাগত হয়ে থাকেন, ব্রাত্য হয়ে থাকেন এই নগর জীবনে, সেটা তার বক্তব্যের মধ্য দিয়ে এসছে। এবং কিভাবে এই জায়গায়, এই প্রেক্ষাপটে সেখানে সরকারি প্রশাসন নতুন ধরনের আইন আনেন, নতুন ধরনের শ্রম আইন, এবং কিভাবে শ্রমিক সংগঠনকে নিয়ন্ত্রণ করা যায়, এবং এর ফলে যে নাগরিক জীবনে সেখানে যে বেকার সমস্যার নতুন চরিত্রের প্রকাশ ঘটে, তাকে কেন্দ্র করে কিভাবে নতুন সামূহিক সত্তা নির্মিত হয়, এই কথাগুলোই তার বক্তব্যের মধ্যে এসছে। এবং শেষ পর্বে তিনি এসছেন সাদার্ন সিটি প্রসঙ্গে। এবং সাদার্ন সিটি প্রসঙ্গে যেটা উনি মনে করিয়ে দিতে চেয়েছেন তার উদাহরণের মধ্য দিয়ে, আসলে যে গ্লোবাল নর্থ এবং সাউথে আমরা আজকাল বিভাজন করি গোটা পৃথিবীকে, সেখানে আসলে নর্থের মধ্যেও একটা সাউথ থাকে এবং সাউথের মধ্যেও নর্থ থাকে। সুতরাং এই জায়গাটাকে মাথায় রেখে উনি যেটা বলবার চেষ্টা করেছেন, আন্তোনিও গ্রামশির কথা উল্লেখ করে, সেখানে এই বিশ্ব নগরী যার কথা উনি বলছেন, যেটা সাস্কিয়া সাসেনের কথায় পাওয়া যায়, সেটা বর্তমান পুঁজিবাদেরই একটা পরিণাম। এবং সেই নগরে কিভাবে রাজনীতির চরিত্র বদল হয়, এই যে রাজনীতির চরিত্র বদল প্রসঙ্গে উনি টেনে এনেছেন জৈব রাজনীতির আরেকটা রূপ, যেটা সমাজের নিচু তলার মানুষের জৈব রাজনীতি, যেটা প্রচলিত জৈব রাজনীতির থেকে আলাদা। এবং এটা তাদের এই যে সমাজের যারা নিচু তলার মানুষ, যারা গরিব মানুষ, তাদের যে সংকট, সেই সংকটের সাপেক্ষে তাদের প্রতিক্রিয়া এবং তাদের জবাব। সুতরাং সেই আলোচনাকে কেন্দ্র করে উনি দেখাবার চেষ্টা করেছেন যে মানুষের মধ্যে কিভাবে, নিচু তলার মানুষের মধ্যে কিভাবে নতুন সম্পর্ক তৈরি হয়, যেটা রাষ্ট্র বা নেশনের তার যে পরিসরেরও বাইরে, এবং বস্তুত এটা এক ধরনের নিচু তলার মানুষের তাদের একটা প্রতিস্পর্ধী আচরণ। তো এই প্রসঙ্গে আমার একটা গ্যাব্রিয়েল গার্সিয়া মার্কেস, যিনি কলম্বিয়ার সাহিত্যিক, নোবেল পুরস্কার প্রাপ্ত, তার একটা কাহিনীর কথা মনে পড়ছে। লিভ স্টর্ম বলে তার একটা বই আছে গল্পের। সেই গল্পে তিনি দেখাচ্ছেন যে এক সম্ভ্রান্ত অভিজাত পরিবারের খুবই একটা কৃত্রিম নৈশভোজে বা যেটা খুবই ভনিতায় ভরা, তো সেরকম একটা নৈশভোজে একজন প্রবীণ ডাক্তার তিনি সেখানে উপস্থিত এবং গৃহ সহায়িকাকে তিনি হঠাৎ বলছেন যে এক কাজ করো, তুমি কিছু ঘাস সেদ্ধ করে আমার জন্য নিয়ে এসো, যাতে মনে হয় সেটাই সুরুয়া অর্থাৎ স্যুপ। তো এই প্রসঙ্গে তখন গৃহ সহায়িকা প্রশ্ন করছেন যে কিরকম ঘাস ডাক্তারবাবু? তো তিনি জবাব দিচ্ছেন সাধারণ ঘাস যেরকম গাধারা খায়। I'll stop here and now this floor is open for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for this enlightening lecture. I'm personally benefited by this lecture a lot. As regards your talk on species and biopolitics, and given the fact that there are lots of displaced, dispossessed and dispersed bodies who live dangerously in modern perverse society, I would like to draw your attention to a specific kind of biopolitics which I call trans biopolitics. How do you think the biopolitical and the necropolitical construction of incarcerated trans bodies all over the world are related to migration and host migration? With the rise of carceral capitalism promulgated by neoliberal economy, does the biopolitical city tend to reject specific trans bodies who do not conform to the normalizing power of transmedicalism? Thus, my question in a nutshell is, how can we perhaps possibly think about a critical ontology of ourselves if we try to set abreast the neoliberal urban reconstruction vis-a-vis the carceralization of trans bodies?
Can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Sri Shankar Basu. I am popularly known as Shisho in my institutional workplace. I am associated with School of Cognitive Science, Jadavpur University. I am a final year PhD scholar out there.
Thank you, Professor Samaddar, for your seminar presentation, as well as opening up a very vast field under the broad category, the urban turn. So you have argued, you have talked about at different points in your lecture of the increasing disconnect between the cities from the hinterland, as well as how the increasing disconnect of the economic fortunes of the urban migrants from the hinterland. So it can be, we may say that in quote-unquote normal times, this may be the normal way of reading it. But in moments of crisis that you also wrote about, during the COVID crisis or the lockdown crisis, so there is a reconnect between the, whether you call it reverse migration or that's a different thing, but some reconnect we have established. And the reconnect can be read in other ways. If we keep in mind the recent farmers movement, how the agrarian distress, so that is another kind of reconnect, how the spectre of the agrarian distress cast its shadow in the urban setting. So this is one thing, and another thing, I don't think that there is time to explore on that, but when you talk about the emergence of the rentier economy in the cities, so you talked about primitive accumulation in early, when you talk about the Christopher's reading of the early modern Europe, but embedded in the story of this emergence of the rentier economy, what is happening in the automobile sector, in the Manesar and other areas, embedded in this story is a story of primitive accumulation. So this is not a place to, but if you reflect broadly on it, so I will benefit. Thank you.
Sir, আমি রবীন্দ্রভারতী ইউনিভার্সিটি থেকে এমএ করছি পলিটিক্যাল সায়েন্সের উপর। তো আমার কোশ্চেন হচ্ছে স্পেসিফিক্যালি আপনাকে যে urbanization is a new crisis for modernization in today new era, and second question হচ্ছে যে urbanization stand for exploit of class, and third question হচ্ছে যে আমার এই যে urbanization মানে যে মাইগ্রেশন ইস্যুটা উঠে আসছে, ফলে সেখানে সিকিউরিটি এবং সোশ্যাল জাস্টিসটিকে রাষ্ট্র কীভাবে এনশিওর করবে, এটাই স্যার।
Brilliant exposition of the urban question. Now I would like to bring your attention to the new stratification that is happening in the urban areas because of the gated communities, the emergence of gated communities and others. And the biopolitics from below, what you are talking about, how this is affecting the social cohesion with these gated communities and the so-called subalterns and others. And Oram Mohala Chatterjee from Calcutta University and CRG.
I'm Shritapa Chakraborty from Rabindranath University. Sir, my question is, you were saying the city is a site of production and circulation. So my point is, city perhaps might also act as a site of silence as well as discipline. So what do you think about the silence of the people? And I'm specifically talking about silence because the very theme of this lecture is the city lights, Charlie Chaplin, where through silence we saw a lot of things and we could interpret a lot of things. So what do you think about the silence of the people who are situated within the zone of biopolitics from below? So is there a politics of silence, and through that does the city act as a site of disciplinary power? Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. I don't think I'll be able to answer all of them with. I won't be able to do justice to all of them. On the trans bodies, I don't have any particular reply. All I can say is that the city means the processing, reprocessing, the violence as well as the, how do you put it, the valorization of the body. Now, whether this is something which is special to the question as you have raised, I think there is, but I'm not very quick to answer that. I also cannot say that, I'm remembering, I think a few days before there was some convention where retired IPS officers said that one can understand that such violence can take place in sex quarters, but how could that take place in a medical college or hospital? So, I'm not very sure that whether this is something extra, meaning qualitatively something. All I can say is that the accepted norms of gender classification, which invariably involve our ideas of the body and the social relations that these bodies produce, it is a part of that. So to what extent there is an extra dimension to it, I'm quite sure there is, but I will not be able to tell that. Also, it will be interesting to those who work on that. We have seen, in fact, there was a researcher who came from, if I remember correctly, from Kampala to our annual winter course, where he described at length his work on transgenders in refugee camps, etc. The persecutions that they face, at the same time the friendships that they create. And they are endowed with friendships. So whether this is something extra, I cannot say. But all I can say is that in the context of the practices of friendship and unity, you have this great question of the human body and how social relations, social ideas are. And I think it's part of that, but I'm quite sure there is something more which I do not know. On the, this is a very interesting question, the city's hinterland, and I don't know who raised this question, there was someone. Oh, yeah. Now, it's true, I mean, the return of migrant labor is certainly something that we all witnessed. And we may say only that these are occasions of shock migration where you fall on the resources that you have. And you fall back on the resources that you have will not be of the same type in recurrent situations. But on the other hand, if you think of Calcutta or think of any other city, Delhi would be again a very good example, where life in Delhi went almost unchanged. At least remarkably, it didn't change when the 1 year long the blockade of Delhi went on. And my submission would be that except votes, the farmers' movement did not matter much to the government, which is why the government could afford to have them on the outskirts of the gates of Delhi. We all know what the government did to prevent the farmers from entering Delhi. The farmers thought that by entering Delhi, they will make a statement, or the sheer act of entering Delhi will be a statement. But if it were the case that Delhi was becoming ungovernable, unmanageable, then the government response would have been different. So, in terms of policies, and this is why I'm saying the urban is not the city. The city is the material reality, but the urban is the, how would you put it, the display site of the city. Precisely its ideological interpolation where you find this undefinable thing called the urban. And that is where the village doesn't matter to the city anymore. It's not what we had in the, let's say, 30, 40 years ago. And if you think of a city like LA or Singapore, or for that matter, Mumbai or Calcutta, they matter as suburbs. So you come to the city by train, long distance train, you go back. In fact, the city makes the suburb. The suburbs do not make the city. The city then creates the grades of urbanity. And now, for example, if you go to the new town on which CIFAR has worked, as you all know, this was even a decade and a half back, let's say a combination of city and a village. But today you go to the new town, you will have service villages which are also flourishing. You will have those guest houses, paid guests and all that. But by and large, the new town in many ways would be, let's say, the most urban today. So it will have an eco park and all the things that a proper city should have, and it will have elements of a very desirable, high quality urban life. On the question of primitive accumulation, again I think your point is very important. I think, and again this is I am treading on slightly uncertain ground, and therefore I am not very sure, I will be tentative, but I will give you an honest reply. If you ask, and if I have understood you rightly, that is there a difference between the earlier moment of primitive accumulation and today? My response would be twofold. One is that perhaps, and I may be wrong, as I said, I am tentative, perhaps we have not studied enough the change and the continuing impact of land and land economy, but more as rent economy, through the industrial age of capitalism, and we are used to thinking that it declined. But two things encourage me to think slightly along a different route. One is, and I know this is not the occasion to go into details, but if we read or reread the third volume of Capital, where Marx goes in depth to analyze the rent question and the Ricardian, his own take on. My understanding is that, and again, this is, I'm too small a person, but with friends we can be open, and if with friends we are not open, then with whom we discuss. So my understanding is that even though it is true that Marx wrote all the volumes of Capital all at one go, and only that they were published later, or changed later, modified later. But let's say, hypothetically, if he were to write volume 3 as volume 1, and linking the last pages or the last part of Capital volume 1 with the rent question, what would have happened? That's number one. It's a very hypothetical question. But the other is that today the rent question is linked not so much in a Ricardian manner to land, but much more in the sense of creating, as many have been arguing, and I have tried to argue in our book also, Logistical Asia, that cities are now logistical cities. The importance of the city is not in the people it houses, not in citizenship politics, not in culture. They are all there, but they are also there. But precisely in the infrastructural, continuous refashioning and redesigning of the city to ensure greater and greater circulation of goods, money and bodies. So in that sense, rent becomes very important. You construct a flyover and you know what happens to the land, on both sides of the thing. So I think the rent question is very much dependent on these things, how you construct corridors, how you create zones, etc. But also the difference between rent and interest is becoming thing. It is very difficult to say that this is interest and this is rent, particularly. See, if you read, let's say Piketty's Capital in the 21st century, Piketty is saying that, well, capital in the 21st century will be like this, but Piketty is actually rereading and going back to the history of the 19th century, where he's showing that your family property, your aristocratic lineage, the loan that you had, he's speaking of the national wars waged by UK, Great Britain in those days. All the dates were finally cleared up at the end of the First World War. He said that it took 100 years. And why it took 100 years? Again, all the non-conventional sources of capital. So the conventional source of capital we all know. But those which are precisely the non-conventional source and which we do not normally treat. So increasingly these differences are getting obliterated. But as I said, I am on tentative ground and I shouldn't. Later on we may fly kites much more. On the social justice thing, it will be interesting to see why the two forms of justice, meaning again the two ideation or two ideas of justice, one is urban justice and the other is social justice. Are they mutually replaceable? Can we replace one with another? And again, the configuration of justice, what we call as social justice, if you take DMK movement in Tamil Nadu, if you take the social justice movements in Kerala, or in the last few decades in Bihar, we know that basically social justice would mean attending the question of caste in particular way, etc. And as caste becomes increasingly important in politics, many of the things will come under the rubric of social justice. Does this include urban justice? I'm quite sure to some extent. But when we imagine something called urban justice, of course social justice is involved in that. We can always say, are we thinking of the West cleaners of Calcutta or Kolkata who would be overwhelmingly Dalits or other religions than Hindu? But when we think of urban justice, do we think of them? And again, this urban in the urban justice is, again, as I am saying, it's a kind of an ideological projection of a materiality to which we give the name city. So what is urban justice? Of course, one of the things would be that migrants would have a right to stay in the city, and one can go on many things. One of the things would be the way in which carceral practices are instituted in the city, and we can go on. And maybe one can say, as I mentioned very briefly, that urban justice would involve many of the things which the poorer people think as commons. And the city is a common. The city, one has a right to the city. But if you read David Harvey or Lefebvre and others, those who speak of city, you can see it's very left, very liberal. The more left it is, the more liberal it is. Or the more liberal it is, the more left it looks like or sounds like. But there is always a given idea that exactly these are the boundaries of the city. And it automatically presumes or assumes that there is something like an external boundary that the city cannot, that others cannot cross. And within the city, that there are these boundaries that will be made and remade. Justice will be perched on that, and justice will not mean doing away or negotiating with that. Even though David Harvey and others have spoken of housing crisis in a major way, but the migrant doesn't figure. On the other hand, interestingly, the person who probably in philosophy spoke city for the first time and in a very emphatic way, let's say Plato, who spoke of the city when speaking of the Republic, the Republic was the city, but in Platonic imagination of what is city, and as he was imagining what is this that is called Athens or Sparta or whatever it is, what its future would be, in that imagination, the outsider was very important. Not that the outsider was very welcome, but the outsider was very important. And this, to some extent, was carried to the Roman times, particularly by the Stoic philosophers. I think gated communities, Mola, which you raised, is again very important. I would only say, maybe we can put it like this, that the more you have slums, the more you would have gated community. So it's not an inverse relation. It's on the other hand, that both are increasing at the same time, and perhaps to the same degree. We would have to find out. But clearly, from the number of people who died during the COVID, I mean, one kind of slum is then producing another kind of slum, but that would be a very uncharitable way of describing. But certainly the idea that we cannot depend on the state, we cannot depend on the government for the services that we need for a minimum habitable endowments, whether it is continuous supply of drinking water, to electricity, to greenery, to, you can think of many things. You know that you have to ensure that by yourself. So you create your own collective. And since you have money, you can do it. And on the other hand, if you think of the slums, you can see that the slum is also a gated community. And the very interesting thing about slum is that, and someone raised the question of silence, when I will come to that in a minute, that if you think of the slums and think not from the angle of sound but from the angle of visibility, you cannot see what is happening in the slum. Exactly, you do not know what is happening in the gated community. So someone comes and murders and leaves the body into 3 pieces, and then 10 days later someone finds out, the police goes, and then you find out that, well, something had happened, which is impossible if it had happened in any old urban locality. In the slum, until and unless someone is letting out the news, it's impossible to tell whether, let us say, country liquor is being produced or not. It is impossible to tell what are the illegal activities are practiced there. The slum, on one hand, you can see it only from the outside, you cannot see it from inside. But the slum people, slum dwellers can see and knows, and they know what is happening. So it's a very interesting relation, that you cannot see the slum only from the outside. You cannot enter it, you cannot see it. Whereas the slum dweller can always observe what is happening on the road, etc. And this is a very interesting story about the New York mayor, as you know, Rudy Giuliani, who wanted to reform New York and purge it of all criminal things. Finally, he created such a particular kind of policing culture, which when was introduced in many of the third world cities, and if not a third world, a second class city like Mexico, or Shoboshachi was referring to Colombia, so Bogota. Great example of kidnapping of people from one zone of the city to another, and it goes on with continuous negotiation. So the public culture and the private culture constantly interacting and thereby questioning our received idea of what is public and what is private. Again, which is a very, very old liberal idea, that there is a public culture of the city and there are privates, because in the slum, what is private and what is public? So in that sense, the gated community, I think, I would look at. And finally, I think the question of silence and sound, I would put again along the line, the problem along the line of visibility and invisibility. And I don't think it's something more or something less. Both are human organs, very important to our material understanding. Thank you.
So if we don't have any other question, then we would conclude this lecture. And I would request Pokshali to propose a formal vote of thanks.
I had a question, not question but a reflection, a comment kind of. So I think from the string of questions which came here, I was thinking that since we are discussing about cities and the specific moment now, the present moment now where we are situated, where it is about circulation of capital, of goods and services and bodies that you have been pointing out. I don't know, sir, I feel it's a very, at present we are living in a very dystopic world where even if you look at the way urbanization has been happening, so as southern countries, as southern cities, as developing countries, this will never probably lead to developed cities or developed countries. I mean, the southern parts, the southern cities in this hemisphere, and maybe it will, I don't know, I mean, it is more, we can see more violence, we can see more dispossession, we can see a lot of unsettlement, unemployment, and so I mean, what this question about urban future is something very unsettling for all of us, because I don't know if we are looking at any future, we are only at the present, and we are trying to respond to the challenges we are facing in the present in terms of, I mean, in different ways. And when looking at even, so when nothing is people-centric, when everything is project-centric, mega projects, construction, etc., then what is this city? I mean, what is, I mean, even a city as a place of transformation, where is it leading to? Is it it's something non-human, inhuman, and where like what other in terms of built environment, if we look at gated communities, and as you pointed out, that slums are also in a way gated communities. But in that case, I mean, I can understand the difference you're pointing out, but even the mobilization of the subaltern, or the connection between people who are working class, who are different categories in the subaltern, I think that is, I don't know, I feel that is a source of strength, that is counter politics from below, that is counter resistance from below, but yeah, but what is the future of that? So
it's also the response, short response. Paushali, I'll give you a short response and hopefully we can continue the discussion. I think I get your point. The future making and future imagining is not a grand act. It is, normally we think it to be a grand act, and we have been schooled in that knowledge that futurist dreamers, they think of the future, they design, they imagine, they discover all that. But the future that we think of is a future-making practice, and precisely many of the things during the COVID time that caregivers and other care workers did created baselines or benchmarks for any future society. Or say in this much maligned city of ours, can we think of any other city in this time where the police and the agitators, or the government and the agitators, negotiating for 1 month without a stone being thrown except on one day, and continuously negotiating as to what is right and what is wrong. And after this, if a government, let us say in this city, decides to use a strong arm tactic to let's say drive away any assembly, any demonstration, it will become very difficult because the standard has been set. If you consider, let's say 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the kind of police methods that we had seen and we were used to. Or on the other hand, other kinds of congregations or other kinds of festivities, schools, caregiving institutions, educational institutions, many things are done to which we do not give this grand name of future activity. So, future is not in that sense an exceptional thing. The future is being made at this moment and always. And in fact, it is in our practices of the present that the future is built. So in that sense, it's somewhat like what the philosopher Adorno had said when he used the term or the phrase negative dialectics. The more you think of future, the more you are thrown back to the present time. You always want to think what we should do 30 years later, and we always think what we are doing, that we would be doing differently. And the more we think of our time, we always think, can there be a better way of doing it? And this is precisely what Adorno was saying, that dialectics has a way of operating, but that way of operating is on the negative side of the logic, and this is what it does. There are many things, but all I am saying is that the future is being made at this hour.
Okay, so what to Ocean?
So the next lecture in this series is on 22nd November. Sorry? 22nd November. It's on 22nd November at Sanskrit College. And we will definitely prepare, let you know in advance, at least a month before, about the topic and the speaker, and we hope it will be an open lecture like this, a physical open lecture. Yeah. Okay, it will be by Professor Shobhashati Vasu Chaudhary, and it will be at Sanskrit College. The topic is new labor in the city. So we are very much looking forward to that, and we hope that you will be able to attend. It will be an afternoon lecture at Sanskrit College. And thanks to all of you for coming here and share. We have been able to spend this time together in this lecture after a long time at Academy of Fine Arts. So yeah, it's the beginning of a journey. Thanks a lot.